Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the Shabbat podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor James W. Barker, and we're going to be discussing his book, Writing and Rewriting the Gospels, John and the Synoptics. I'll have the link to purchase the book in the affiliate link in the description below and in the pinned comment. With that being said, thank you for joining me today, James.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to talk to you again.
And likewise. Can you tell us a bit about what do you mean by writing and rewriting the Gospels?
Good question. Why that title? So I start with writing because I think that there are a lot of misconceptions about the writing process of any book in antiquity, particularly the Gospels. So I wanted to look first at just how any book was written, how the Gospels would have been written in typical Greco-Roman format. What are the forms of media that would have been used? And again, some of those misconceptions that's just what people used back then, so it would not have been too hard for them. So modern scholars sometimes exaggerate things of that nature. The rewriting aspect has to do with the proliferation of the Gospels. Why do we have more than one in the first place? Why not just have one Gospel, tell the story, and then be done with that? And so the literary mode of rewriting is incredibly common. We see it already in the Tanakh, where Deuteronomy is rewriting earlier laws. First and Second Chronicles is rewriting Samuel Kings. So it's not that surprising that there would be more than one gospel, and that there would be imitation. And so when we have multiple gospels, it's because they're rewriting their sources. But then the subtitle of John and the Synoptics has to do with, it's not just that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are interrelated as is necessarily the case with so much verbatim agreement. I want to advance that argument beyond and say it's John who's participating in the same type of process, that John is also rewriting the Synoptics, and that has not been the consensus up to now, but it's a really hard thing to pin down if there even is or ever was a consensus as to John's use of the Synoptics.
Why have scholars believed that John was independent of the Synoptics for so long? And what led you to conclude that John did know the Synoptic Gospels?
It's a great question. The main thing is that it is pretty different. And if you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you read so much of the material, the same stories, the same settings, the same characters, the same dialogues and controversies, that you know they have to be interrelated in some way. And when you get to the Gospel of John, a rough count of would be like 80% of what you find in the Gospel of John does not have a parallel with the Synoptics. So I think for a very long time in critical scholarship, there was an assumption that if John had used the Synoptics, it would have looked so much like what Matthew and Luke, I say, would have done to Mark, that it would be unmistakable in its family resemblance. It's that John takes such divergences, introduces new characters, new episodes, new settings, that a lot of people said, well, that's just independent. And then we had in the early 20th century a real emphasis on oral tradition. So that then became the way to explain everything that was different from the Synoptics. Oh, well, John just has this whole stream of source material that is lost to us. And there's been, I think, helpfully a breakdown of a lot of the assumptions underlying that oral tradition. And I started in my dissertation, which was, I guess I defended in 2011, was published in 2015 as John's use of Matthew, because at that time, almost nobody thought that John had any relationship to Matthew. And I had just become convinced in the course of my graduate studies that where there were similarities, say that 20% where John does have parallels with the Synoptics, that John had to know Matthew. And so I kept my dissertation tight just to one argument, a few case studies, just to advance this thesis that was not widely accepted, But I knew even then that I could carry it forward, and I had already come across some ways that this could also extend to Mark, and that could extend to Luke. And in a lot of ways, those are even easier in terms of making an argument than it was to say that John knew Matthew.
What is the total estimate of early Christian literacy?
Usually about 10% is a good estimate. We don't really have any way of knowing for sure. And it's also important to qualify that there are a lot of different degrees of literacy. Today, in a modern educational setting, beginning in kindergarten, students learn to read and to write simultaneously, as though those two things just go hand in hand. And there's actually no reason why they have to. You could be fully literate in the sense that you could read and be a very good reader and very well read. But I, for example, am not a very good graphic artist. And that sort of graphic facility is what's required for writing. So someone could read a lot, but not really be able to write a lot. We actually see this on contracts where people will sign their names and the handwriting is very sloppy, but they can at least write their name, and the scribe has written a contract, and you can see the nice, neat margins and the lines that the scribe has kept to. And then the contract is witnessed by so-and-so, and it becomes sort of childlike, crooked, inconsistent. And so we think, okay, there's a functional literacy where it might have been beneficial to be able to sign your name in society. But we even see contracts where someone just makes a mark, and the scribe says, this is the mark of so-and-so, son of so-and-so. So there are a lot of different types of literacy. But when we start talking about the amount of education it would take to write something like a gospel, and the gospels have been called, Loveday Alexander famously called them middlebrow literature. It's not lowbrow, but it's definitely not the sort of highbrow. Classicists can look at the New Testament documents and frown upon them for their style of Greek, that it is not very classy, and they're not wrong in that. But just to attain that degree of literacy is something like we might consider a college education, and back then had to be 10% or less.
Can we tell how much of a role oral tradition played in the formation of the Gospels?
There had to be some oral tradition. I don't think anybody denies that there was oral tradition, because I don't think anybody would say everything about Jesus was entirely made up by the people who wrote the Gospels. Can we tell what was oral tradition? I think not. And I proudly join the ranks of folks like Robin Walsh you've had on your show, and she does a phenomenal job of just saying it is completely irrecoverable. We have no idea what oral tradition was. If you forced me to say, show me one good piece of oral tradition, I might say something like the Lord's Prayer, right? But that is as far as I would go. And I wouldn't deny that there's oral tradition that led to some of the content of the Gospels. I would simply say, you don't really know. You don't know what the Gospel writers were writing by themselves. You don't know what they got from some source. We don't know who those sources are. And I think, to put it bluntly, that it is sort of a fool's errand to try to reconstruct a lot of oral tradition and the forms that it takes. If you go back to the early 20th century with form criticism, and you say, oh, look, this is the form of a miracle story. There's a setting, and say it's a healing narrative. So someone is introduced as a character who has a certain sickness, and then Jesus will usually have some sort of back and forth, but ultimately Jesus does the miracle, and everyone was amazed. And there's a typical form to it. And so for the form critics, That had to do with the way the story was told and retold and remembered. And for someone like me, I just say that's the literary form of writing a miracle story. And once I know the form, I can copy and like Mad Libs, if you ever did those fill in the blank things on such and such day, so and so had such and such sickness, and I can write you a miracle story because I know the form. So I think the form that the stories take is in no way indicative of there must have been this oral source underlying it. To me, it's every bit as likely that it's just the way you write a miracle story, and you can apply that on and on to dominical sayings, whatever the form was that was supposedly a sign of the underlying oral tradition, and just say, well, that's just how people knew how to write, and they learned to write by imitating. We know that for a fact, and so writers simply imitated this formulaic way of telling a story.
What is Mully-Zahn's take on the rediscovery and rewriting of the text?
Who is that? Molly Zahn. Yes, she has an excellent book on genres of rewriting in Second Temple Judaism, and I hope I have that title right. Close enough. Zahn is the last name, and it is such a deep dive into how prevalent rewriting was as a mode of authorship and writing and literary production in the period when the Second Temple was still standing. You know, what we commonly call Greco-Roman, up until the destruction of the temple. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a great example of this. A book like Jubilees can take stories of Genesis, Exodus, and some other Torah material and completely rewrite the story and give you something new. So we see a whole lot of this. It is not at all uncommon. And as I mentioned earlier, it goes back to Torah itself. Deuteronomy is, in Greek anyway, literally the second telling of the law. You've already read most of those laws. If you've read Exodus, Leviticus, and a little bit that's in Numbers, and Deuteronomy says, well, let me simplify it for you. Let me reiterate it. Here's the 10 commandments for sure, in case you forgot those. And here are some new laws, and here are some slight revisions to the old ones. And that becomes canonical as Torah, the same way in the Ketuvim, the writings, the chronicler's work. Let me retell for you what you already know about the kings of Israel and Judah from reading Samuel and Kings. A lot of it's going to be the same, but some of it's going to be different. Let me do that for you. And here it is. That too becomes canonical. Josephus then comes along and says, let me tell you the history of ancient Israel, and I'm going to use all that biblical material, including Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. So there are a lot of people engaged in the endeavor of rewriting, and it shouldn't strike us as odd. And just because it's rewritten, that does necessitate that it is derivative. That in no way diminishes the value of the rewritten work. And so some scholars even debate the term, well, should we call such and such text an example of rewritten scripture? And they raise that concern because they don't want it to sound like they're denigrating the literary product. So I simply qualify, if we're talking about something as rewritten, that doesn't in any way diminish its value, especially in the case of the pluriform gospels that we end up with in the New Testament. I think that it's nothing out of the ordinary, and we see classical authors doing the same thing. I mean, for crying out loud, Virgil in the Aeneid is rewriting Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, but recasting the Greek epic as a Roman epic. And so it's not at all unusual for there to be rewriting, and that we end up with proliferation of gospels. Eva Mroczek has the line, like, proliferation is a value. It shows that it's good, that it's good enough to copy and then distinguish and then collect and compare. And those are some of the paths I say at the beginning of the book that I have taken to say these are the working assumptions I have of how people wrote way back then, and that's how we end up with multiple gospels.
What is the synoptic problem?
Well, the synoptic gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the name synoptic simply means that you can look at them side by side and closely compare them, because, as I've mentioned, there's just so much that's reiterated. Roughly 90% of Mark is usually the rough percentage. If you read Matthew and Luke, you'll reread 90% of what you already knew from Mark, if not more. So scholars from the earliest times, and I mean in patristic times, the earliest centuries, have been comparing these gospels and their similarities and their differences, and noting them and trying to explain why this would be different from that. And there have been a lot of theories as to how to solve the synoptic problem. And the dominant solution in 20th century has been that Mark wrote first, and that then there was a document called Q that we have lost but can be reconstructed, and Matthew and Luke independently used Mark and Q to write their gospels. And I take a different approach if you want to go down that road. But in short, the synoptic problem is simply saying, why are Matthew, Mark, and Luke so similar and yet so different? And what we have to assume is that somebody's copying from someone else, or else they would not be this similar.
We do have a super chat question I'd like to take before we continue. I efficient time, thank you for your super chat. Apostle Matthew was a publican. Isn't it likely he wrote things down during the life of Jesus? Could this be Hebrew Matthew Papias refers to and is lost?
Could be. I say early in my book, we actually have no idea who wrote the Gospels. We simply have early traditions about who these authors were. So the idea that Matthew was a tax collector, he goes by the name Levi in the Gospels of Mark and Luke, and the tax collector who leaves his toll booth to follow Jesus and become one of the 12 apostles, he's given the name Matthew in what we know as the Gospel of Matthew. I don't think that at all necessitates that the author of what we know as the Gospel of Matthew was actually written by that eyewitness and apostle. There's a long church tradition that he was, just as there's a long church tradition that John was John, the son of Zebedee, and that's who wrote the Gospel we know as the Gospel according to John. There's the idea that Mark was Peter's companion in Rome and his translator, and that Luke was friends with Paul, who knew the other apostles and got their information from them. None of the gospel texts, no New Testament text makes those claims. Those are all tradition. So it's not scripture, it's tradition, and it's fine to believe that tradition. It's fine to hypothesize that if folks want to. And the idea that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew, the problem with that is it really doesn't look like it's translated. You can read something like the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, and you can tell that it's a translation, even if it's a very good one. And Matthew, as we have it, simply doesn't look like it's the product of translation. Is it possible? Yes. Can I prove conclusively that it was not the case? No. But for me, I don't want to start from an assumption that is largely unfounded. And one of the things I do say in my book is that I think a lot of credit goes to 19th century scholarship for finally uncoupling Peter from Mark, because I don't think that Mark's gospel really reflects Peter as we know him from the gospels and from Paul's letters. I think Mark's gospel is a whole lot more like Paul. And so once you get rid of that working assumption that Peter and Mark are so closely wed, a lot of vistas open up to you to see things in a new light.
All right. So I'm going to pull up a couple of slides real quick. we go. So this is James Barker's book, everybody. I just want to have this right here so everyone can see it. I have the affiliate link again in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment at the conclusion of the stream. The book just came out, so go get it. Yeah, so this slide is based on a diagram in your book, in which you show all these different solutions to the synoptic problem. I just want you to discuss this a little bit about these various different solutions, like the Griesbach, Farrer hypothesis, Augustinian hypothesis, two free source hypothesis, and then of course we have the Matthean posteriority right over here.
Yep. Sure. I mentioned the two source a little bit already. That Q is short for Quelle, which just means source in German. But the idea is it was largely a sayings source. And you'll notice with the two source hypothesis, there's no line connecting Luke and Matthew. I did my undergraduate work under Dave Dungan at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and he was a Griesbach adherent, one of very few of his kind. There are almost none of them left. And what they were doing back in the day is reviving the Griesbach hypothesis. We should probably rewind to the so-called Augustinian hypothesis, which very simplistically looked at Matthew, Mark, and Luke as the order that the Gospels appear in the Vulgate, in the Latin Bible, and in most, but not all Greek, and not even all Old Latin manuscripts. But it becomes the standard order of the Gospels by Augustine's day. And he writes a very long treatise opposing pagan philosopher Porphyry, who had read the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament very extensively, and pointed out all its contradictions and said, basically, none of this adds up. You'd be stupid to believe it. And so Augustine thought he needed to answer all those objections. So he very closely scrutinized all the similarities and the differences. But when he talks about, and this is not a fundamental or foundational piece of his treatise, but it sort of comes through tradition to be taken that way for over 1,000 years, that, well, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, that's the order we see the Gospels in my Bible. That must be the order that they were written in, or else they wouldn't have been put in that order. Simplistic, because we can find almost every combination of Gospels if you look at enough manuscripts, but it does become the norm. So what Griesbach did in the late 18th century was to say, I don't think that's what happened at all. I think that Matthew wrote first, as had long been assumed. But then I think Luke just worked from Matthew, and Mark came along last of the three, and he just sort of summarized those three, or his two predecessors. So the Griesbach hypothesis caught on. It was something new. It opened up study of the synoptic problem, and is a very important placeholder to say there's a lot that we need to reinvestigate. And that's what happened throughout the 19th century. And so for a while, if you look at, say, the Tübingen school in the early 19th century, the Griesbach hypothesis was what was hot, what was new and fresh, and that's what folks adhered to. But over the course of the 19th century, we had really just, you can't overstate the significance of Markan priority. The idea that Mark has to be written first. Mark is the shortest of the three. It's lacking in the most details, and it makes much more sense to see Matthew and Luke working from Mark and supplementing it. Then the question is there a relationship between Matthew and Luke, or did they independently use this other source? And so 19th century scholarship posited that there were some sayings, and over the course of the 20th century, Q as this source, predominantly sayings, a few narratives, it becomes entrenched as a written document, and is even reconstructed. You can today buy the critical edition of Q and see exactly how scholars have reconstructed what they think that it said. The problem is it's gone. And I was sort of prone to Q skepticism by studying with Dungan, because I don't think his solution, the Griesbach solution, is correct. But I think he and his friends did a lot of excellent work that's often overlooked, because they talked about what we call the minor agreements. Forget about the sayings that are common to Matthew and Luke that aren't in Mark. That's what Q is supposed to give you. Just take the stories that are in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you can find plenty of places where Luke and Matthew line up and they have some detail that's not in Mark. And then you get the inverse of that. Mark has given you some detail, and Matthew and Luke will omit exactly the same detail at exactly the same place. So for a lot of scholars, it just makes sense to have a line connecting Matthew and Luke. Then the question is, how are they related? And it's a chicken and egg question. But I think the Farrer hypothesis, Austin Farrer wrote a famous essay in defense of it. It's called On Dispensing with Q. And then you end up with the work sorry, my cat is at my feet. So she can't decide if she would like to join the podcast or not. But you're more than welcome to, Pumpkin, if you want. The book is dedicated in part to you as a family member. Michael Goulder wrote a commentary on the Gospel of Luke, and he was a Farrer advocate, and so he popularized it. Ed Sanders wrote Studying the Synoptic Gospels with Margaret Davies, and they say maybe we should look a little more closely at this Farrer hypothesis, and it gains a little bit more and more momentum. And then Mark Goodacre writes The Case Against Q, and says, gives a lot of good reasons why Mark was written first, Matthew then, that's Pumpkin's tail, Matthew was written second, and Luke was written third, and he used both Matthew and Mark as a source. And I love the wording in the introduction to the book. Goodacre says about Q, this long lost source, right? The only thing we have to lose is something no one's ever found. So if we just get rid of Q, we can have what I like to think of as an accordion, and you fully squeeze it together and you've got the Gospel of Mark. We have no idea how old Jesus is. He just comes from Nazareth. He's an adult, presumably. He gets baptized by John the Baptist. He gets the Holy Spirit. He starts doing miracles, and he dies at the end. We're told that he's a great teacher, but we don't know a whole bunch of his teachings. He just tells some parables, and nobody seems to understand what they mean. And then what does Matthew do? Well, he expands the accordion. So the beginning and the middle and the end. Let's tell you Jesus's birth. In the middle, exactly where Mark says Jesus was such a great teacher, everybody was astounded by his teaching. He wasn't like their scribes. That's where Matthew inserts the Sermon on the Mount, so you know exactly what that teaching was. Mark originally ended with an account that Jesus had raised from the dead, but it's just something that some young man told some women, and they didn't tell anybody. The end. Well, Matthew has the risen Jesus show up and actually talk to the women, tell them what the angel had told them, and says, go get my disciples, I'll meet them in Galilee. And sure enough, he does that. Luke expands the accordion even beyond, so that we meet John the Baptist for the baptism. Well, where did he come from? Come to find out, he's a relative of Jesus. We get a birth story for him too. We get more teachings in the middle, parables that are unique to Luke that we don't see in the other Gospels. And then at the end, I would say Matthew leaves you dangling. He thinks that he's cleaning up a problem that you see in Mark, because Mark doesn't even tell you that Jesus, it tells you that Jesus rose, but we don't encounter the risen Jesus. So Matthew cleans that up by giving you a resurrection appearance. But Jesus's final words are to his disciples, I will be with you forever until the end of the world. Which raises the question of where Jesus is. So Luke will end the gospel with the ascension story, where Jesus gets into a cloud and he goes up into the heavens, and that's where he stays. And if you read the sequel in the book of Acts, he has to stay there until final judgment. You just have to take the apostles' word for it that he rose from the dead. So that simple order from Mark to Matthew to Luke on that macro scale, to me, is what came to convince me that the Farrer hypothesis is right. You mentioned Matthean posteriority. Well, what if Mark came first, then Luke wrote his gospel, and then Matthew came along last? Well, the accordion model doesn't work for that, because we get this weird sort of, you're actually playing the accordion and you're expanding and compressing it as you go. There are also plenty of details as I talk about the synoptic problem and some characteristics of Luke's style, some features you would expect to find that you just don't see at all from Matthew, but you can see Luke reading something in Matthew and changing it, or reading a place where Matthew just sort of slavishly followed Mark, and Luke says, we need to set that up. We need to introduce that better, or we need to relocate it. There are just too many places for me where I think it makes the most sense to go neatly from Mark to Matthew to Luke, and see that as what I call throughout the book, these snowballing trajectories. And they even extend into the Gospel of John. So you can see these snowballs from Mark to Matthew to Luke and solve the synoptic problem. You can also see John's use of the synoptics in the same way.
And what would you say is the strongest evidence that you see in the Gospel of John for its knowledge of the synoptics?
Oh, there's a lot. And Mark Goodacre, I mentioned, he has a book coming out on the same subject, and he gives a nice long list of places where John presupposes something from the synoptics. Stephen Hunt has an excellent book on the feeding of the 5,000. It was his doctoral dissertation, and he shows you in meticulous detail where just in that one story, in John 6:1-15, you have pieces of Matthew, Mark, and Luke that are distinct to each one. What we call redaction. So Mark comes first, Matthew adds a detail. For example, that Mark says there were 5,000 men, and it is specifically men who were at this feeding miracle. And Matthew adds 5,000 men, not counting the women and the children. Well, John has a child because none of the synoptics tell you where Jesus got his 5 loaves of bread and his 2 fish. But John says, it's from this Paidarion, this boy who is not a man. So he has this idea from Matthew that there weren't just men there. There were also women and children. And Hunt goes on and on. There are a lot of those places, and some of them have been seen before, like Steve's book, but also Franz Nierink wrote a couple of times in this resurrection appearance in the Gospel of John. Jesus will tell the women, "Stop touching me," and you've not let go of me. Don't be touching me is literally what he says. And Harold Attridge wrote an essay called "Don't Be Touching Me," and he explains what's going on in that story. But what John is doing with that is presupposing something that you see in the Gospel of Matthew, that the 2 Marys who encounter the risen Jesus grab hold of his feet. But in Matthew, he doesn't tell them to let go. In John, we're not told that they grabbed hold of him, but Jesus does tell them to let go. And so that phenomenon is called interlocking. And so previous scholars have noted these places where John interlocks with the synoptics, and it makes the most sense to say, I think that's what he has in mind. You think of Richard Bauckham's essay, John for readers of Mark. Like, if you know Mark, you already know some of these characters. So there are just a ton of places. My dissertation on John's use of Matthew, I would say this is a good example of John clearing up something with the Samaritans, the Samaritan question. You maybe didn't even know it was a question, but it actually is, because Mark's gospel says absolutely nothing about Samaritans. But if you trace Jesus's route from Galilee to Jerusalem, he deliberately avoids Samaria. He has to cross the Sea of Galilee to begin the journey, and then later is in Jericho, which means, okay, somehow he got on the other side of the Jordan River, and it looks like he's taken this circuitous route to avoid going into Samaria. Matthew makes it explicit. Jesus sends out his 12 apostles and he commands them, don't go to any Samaritans. They are not to receive this, and don't go to any Gentiles either. But if you read to the end of the Gospel of Matthew, the Gentiles get picked up. They are the ones who receive the Great Commission. Now go to the Gentiles, teach them everything that I taught you. What about the Samaritans? They're completely left out. And then Luke wants to massage that a little and say, well, Jesus didn't reject the Samaritans so much as the Samaritans rejected Jesus, because Jesus actually tried to stay this one time at this Samaritan village, but the Samaritans rejected him. So, that's why they didn't get the mission. But if you read Luke's sequel, the book of Acts, then there's a mission to the Samaritans. And John looks at all of that and says, no, Jesus went to Samaria. He stayed there 2 days. There was in a whole village of Sychar, there were these people who proclaimed him to be the savior of the world. So does John write that in a vacuum, or does John write that with a purpose and with knowledge that there were Samaritans who were following Jesus at the time, that none of the previous Gospels were particularly kind to them or painted them in a particularly good light? And so John solves that and says, oh, they believed him. And all the while, the Jews were rejecting Jesus, but not the Samaritans. So, I could go on, and I've got a whole chapter in the book of John's use of the synoptics and ways that we see these snowball trajectories. But that's one example of a nice, neat progression, I think, from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John. And each one has to know the work of each predecessor. And that's the central thesis of my book.
What do you make of the great omission in Luke? Why is it in that block that he leaves out the feeding of the 4,000, Jesus walking on water, and a bunch of other stuff?
It's a great question. Ultimately, I don't know. The feeding of the 4,000, you could say he's leaving out because of its redundancy. He's already given you the feeding of the 5,000. And he wants to make room for original material that he's going to add. We've got the parable of the lost sheep that we already know. You can read that in Matthew. But what about the lost coin? And what about the lost son in Luke 15? What about this story about the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16? If Luke's got all this other material that he wants to put in, he has to make some cuts somewhere. And think in modern terms of a film. There's a run length that just gets too long. If you watch a director's edition, there might be another hour to a film you love, and it's everything the director wanted in there, but the production company said, no, that's too long. The audience will leave. Well, I think Gospels kind of function that way. Luke's already the longest of the 4 Gospels. And so he has to make some cuts to add all the material. If you want a birth narrative of John the Baptist, you got to cut something else somewhere. So I think that's part of it. Why leave out the walking on the water? It's a great question. I have no idea. It follows so naturally in Matthew, Mark, and John that Jesus feeds the 5,000 and then he walks on water. We've got the calming of the storm. I don't know. I can't explain it all. But in general terms, I would say anytime we see any gospel writer omitting something from a source, it has something to do with their own desire to add something new to the Jesus story. And Luke adds the most of the synoptics. Luke has the most unique material. And then John, of the 4 canonical gospels, has by far the most unique material. And so he cuts the vast majority of the stories from the synoptics, or he completely rewrites them in a way that all the details are inverted.
How do Matthew and Luke use Mark differently from one another?
They're definitely not identical. There are times that they're definitely going to change the order of things. There's a great essay by Greg Carey that I can't cite enough, so I try to cite it in just about everything I write, called "Moving Things Ahead." This is a characteristic move that Luke makes. For example, when you get to the crucifixion, out of nowhere, Mark will tell you, oh, and there were these women. They were at the crucifixion, not Jesus' disciples. They had all forsaken him and fled. But these women were standing there and they were watching. They had followed him the whole time from Galilee. And the reader thinks, what? There were women there like the whole time that you never thought to mention? And Mark's like, yeah, there were. And Matthew gets to the same point in Mark and does exactly what Mark does. He's like, oh, yeah, I don't need to introduce these women any earlier. I'll just wait till the crucifixion scene and say, like Mark did, yeah, there were these women and they had been following the whole time. Well, what does Luke do? He goes all the way back to chapter 8. He moves the anointing of Jesus. It doesn't happen in Bethany, and it's not the week that Jesus died. It happened way back in the Galilee at some indeterminable point, long before the Passion narrative even commenced. This woman anoints Jesus, and then Luke has a setup to say, and there were women who were following, and here were some of their names. And so Luke is adding that distinctly. And so Luke moves that ahead again, like Greg Carey argued in his article. The same thing happens, I argue, with and not just me, but with this story in the gospel in when you get to the apocalyptic discourse right before the Passion, before the Last Supper and the betrayal of the crucifixion. Jesus is saying in the Gospel of Mark, well, the final judgment's going to come, and it's going to happen. The armies are going to come, and you're going to have to make a run for it, and it all sounds like and then right then the end will happen, and it sounds like everything's going to happen immediately. And Mark says, it's like when a slave owner comes back. He's left his slaves in charge, but he comes back, and it's a reckoning. And so that's this metaphor for final judgment. Well, Matthew comes to that point in the discourse, and he takes that saying and he turns it into a full-blown parable. And he says, once upon a time, there was a slave owner, and he went away for a long time, lest you think that final judgment is imminent, right? And then he divided up, and he gave this slave this, and he gave that slave that, and he told him to go make some money, and he came back, there was a reckoning. Luke rewrites that parable, but he moves it farther ahead so that it's before Jesus even enters Jerusalem, and the narrator just hits you on the nose with it and says, Jesus told this parable so that the disciples would not think that the end was going to happen immediately. It was going to happen eventually, but final judgment was not going to happen soon. So there are some noticeable differences in how Matthew and Luke use Mark, even if they're doing the same thing, like, let me tell you a parable about a slave owner who left his slaves in charge. They'll rewrite, Matthew will write a parable that was just based on a saying in Mark. Luke will rewrite Matthew's parable and will move it much earlier in the narrative to make this point that the end's going to happen, and when it happens, it'll happen suddenly, but don't hold your breath.
What do you make of the Synoptics' portrayal of Jesus insulting the scribes and Pharisees?
That's a good one. It's one I spent quite a bit of time on, because for people who think that Matthew and Luke are not related, that's one of the things that you can separate these out. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus is going to denounce the scribes and the Pharisees, and he's going to give a lot of the same insults. If you read Luke, earlier on, he has denounced the Pharisees, then he denounces the scribes, and those are kept separate. And there's some overlap in the insults, but they're not the same. And so I asked myself, why would this be? Why would Luke split this apart? If I'm right, and Luke is reading Matthew, why take what was so neatly tied together there in Matthew and split it apart? And the thing I found is Luke has this tendency to get Pharisees off the hook, to not paint them in such a bad light. So you have the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee, but the that's not necessarily a negative portrayal. You could read Amy Jo Levine's book on parables and see that we shouldn't denigrate the Pharisees for that. At one point in Matthew and Mark, the Pharisees are so angry at Jesus that they want to kill him. And so Luke takes that line and rewrites it to say, and the Pharisees just got together and said, what are we going to do about this guy? They're not planning to kill him. And when you get to Jerusalem, the Pharisees aren't involved in anything. They are not part of the plot against Jesus. They say to Jesus, hey, people are calling you a king. Don't say that. And Jesus says, let him say it. But you can read that in Luke's gospel as though that's a warning, that they're actually concerned for his well-being. Because earlier in Luke's gospel, Luke is the only one who tells you this. They come to Jesus, the Pharisees, and say, hey, Herod Antipas is out to kill you. And Jesus is like, let him do whatever he's going to do. He comes on the Baptist. He wants to come at me. Bring it on. But they seem concerned for him. And so again and again, Luke is going to have these characters. And if you think that Acts comes from the same person or the same circle as the Gospel of Luke, we're going to have Pharisees following Jesus at the very beginning in Jerusalem after the resurrection. So Luke very much wants to restore the image of the Pharisees while keeping those denunciations like, yeah, Jesus said that, but why split apart the woes to the scribes and the Pharisees? Because the Pharisees need to be back in the Galilee and not part of the plot in Jerusalem. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus denounces the Pharisees in Jerusalem as part of the Passion narrative, and the Pharisees are part of the plot against Jesus that gets him killed in Jerusalem. And Luke wants to do some revisionist history and say, no, that I don't like that at all. And that explains why I think what was one set of denunciations against two groups in Matthew is neatly split into two different places, locations, and the groups are being kept separate to keep with Luke's overarching point of let's exculpate the Pharisees as much as we can.
What about the feedings in the Gospels? What do you make of Mark and Matthew having two feedings, whereas Luke and John only have one?
I think, again, it is just to save space. I think that's the primary motivation. And if you look at John's gospel, in the feeding of the 4,000, Jesus in Matthew and Mark will look up to the heavens and he will give thanks for the bread. He doesn't bless it as he did in Matthew, Mark, and Luke at the feeding of the 5,000. He gives thanks for it, which is Eucharist, literally in Greek. And so when John tells you the feeding of the 5,000, he puts in that Eucharistic language, and then he gives you the whole bread of life discourse that you have to eat my flesh, you have to drink my blood, and it's Eucharist all day long. Well, where does he get the idea that Jesus looked to the sky and he didn't bless the bread, he gave thanks for it, Eucharist? Well, I think he's read the feeding of the 4,000. He just doesn't need it. How are you going to have room for this long bread of life discourse if you're going to repeat the feeding miracle? He only needs one. And so you can see Matthew showing a tendency to double characters. Let me give you two blind men instead of just one. And let me not just give you two blind men. Let me give you two healings of two blind men on two separate occasions. So Matthew has this multiplying tendency, right? And we see Luke being much more economical and leaving these things out. But so I think that explains Luke just wants to save space for the material that he's going to write. The same thing for John. But when you look at John's gospel on the whole, again, up to 80% of it doesn't have any parallel, so that he leaves that out among other things. The key for him is the feeding of the 5,000 and that it's Eucharistic and that it's much, much earlier. We do not see anything at the Last Supper that's Eucharistic. This bread is my body, this wine is my blood. He's already covered that ages ago, right? That's one of the characteristic changes that John makes to the Synoptics.
How does Luke frame the paralysis healing?
It's a really good example. It's one I almost always use. I have even on my academia.edu page a handout. It's a legal sized handout that I've made. It shows you on one side, here are the main solutions to the synoptic problem, and on the flip side, here is here's a synopsis that I've made. And if it's the same word in English, it's because it's the same word in Greek. And if it's a different word in English, it's a different word in Greek. The Dewey and Miller complete gospel parallels, they've done that for the entirety of the gospels. And it is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. I've done it for one story, but it's the one I use when I teach in class. And I think it's a good example of just what Luke is up to. I mean, if we go back to the feeding miracle, you see in Matthew, Jesus is healing people, and in Mark, Jesus is teaching people. Well, what does Luke say? Jesus was healing and he was teaching, right? So he seems to know what both of them are doing. And so, but the paralysis healing is great for what I call like a master shot in film terms, where all of a sudden you have scribes and who speak up against Jesus. The Pharisees are grumbling and complaining against Jesus. And what Luke does is at the very beginning of the story to tell you that one day when Jesus was teaching, and there were Pharisees and there were Torah teachers, which he later calls scribes, who were there. And so you're not surprised when they speak up as part of the story. When you read Matthew and Mark, you're surprised that they speak up, and you thought it was just going to be a healing story, and it turns into a healing story that's coupled with a controversy story, and you don't know who the controversy is going to be with because the characters have not been introduced. Luke doesn't like that, and Luke characteristically hates surprises, so he introduces the characters in advance so that you're not surprised when they show up.
Who is carrying the swords?
Yeah, that's another place. It's another surprise that Luke hates, so he eliminates it. And there's a sword fight in all four canonical gospels when Jesus is arrested, and a guy gets his ear cut off, and the swords literally come out of nowhere in Matthew, Mark, and John. And so Luke gets you the Last Supper scene, and then before they leave, Jesus says, "Hey, sell your clothes and buy yourself a sword." And then disciples say, "Hey, we have 2 swords." And Jesus says, "That'll do." And they take the swords with them. And it's like the old adage for playwriting. If you introduce a gun in Act 1, it better go off by Act 3. So as soon as Luke introduces these swords, we get a sword fight. It doesn't take very long when the arrest scene occurs, and John's going to say it wasn't just one of the disciples; it was Peter who cut off the ear of the slave of the high priest. And John giving you those kinds of details is something he does characteristically. It wasn't just some people or the disciples who were complaining about how expensive the ointment was that the woman anointed Jesus with. It was Judas, because Judas was greedy. And it wasn't just the disciples talking about where the food was going to come from. It was Jesus asking Philip where the food would come from at the feeding of the 5,000. And Andrew says, "I stole this little boy's lunch." So we see this kind of tendency in John to assign individual speaking parts to individual characters. We see this tendency throughout Luke to read something and say, that comes out of nowhere. Better rhetoric would adduce this so that readers are less surprised when they encounter it. And you had asked earlier, well, what's the problem with Matthean posteriority? Well, none of those pieces of Lucan redaction ever show up in Matthew. And granted, it's a bit of an argument from silence, but it sure seems to be a characteristic tendency of Luke, where he sees Matthew slavishly following Mark, and Luke thinks he's writing you a better framed narrative in ancient rhetorical terms.
We have a super chat question from iFish Natalia. Thank you for your super chat. Is the Olivet discourse an allusion to the Pella flight?
It could be. I don't get too specific. I think the whole thing is talking about the Jewish revolt that culminates in the destruction of the temple. I mean, technically, the Jewish revolt culminates in the destruction of Masada in 73, but for all practical purposes, in 70, when the temple is destroyed, that's the end. I think that the Gospels are written after that has already happened, and I think that they all assume that the temple is destroyed, and that that readers would know that there had been a revolt in Judea, that the temple was destroyed, and when readers read Jesus's prediction that that the temple's going to be destroyed and that there's going to be a revolt or there's going to be a war and you're going to have to run for the hills, then that's what's being talked about. And then how exactly and precisely we can locate who went where and when, I don't go beyond that. I just say the whole thing's talking about the Jewish revolt. Mark seems to think it marks the beginning of the end and that the end of the world is about to happen. And Matthew says, well, it's going to take a while. And Luke says it's going to take a long while. And then John, with what is known as realized eschatology, just says, you don't have to wait at all. Final judgment's already here. You either believe now or you don't believe. And that's final judgment. So yeah, I think that that picture of final judgment is crucial for early Christianity being what it becomes, but it didn't take long for folks to figure out that that they were going to be here for a while after the Jewish War, and I think all the Gospels were written sometime after that had happened, and sometimes before Ignatius was writing, because I think we have pretty clear traces of Ignatius knowing Matthew, Luke, and John. And if Mark was the first gospel written, that entails that it had been written too. And so that gets us to around the year 110. I think anywhere in that 40-year window, we get the gospels written.
Who is Pilate, and why does he call Jesus the King of the Jews?
In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus rides into Jerusalem and a whole crowd says, blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. And so that would entail Jesus's kingship. And so in Mark's Gospel, Jesus is brought to Pontius Pilate, and we're not told what his rank is. We eventually learn that he's in the Praetorium, or the Praetorium. And so it's, okay, that's the governor's headquarters. You can sort of figure out he must have been the governor, but he's not introduced as that. Mark could just be saying Pilate was in Jerusalem for Passover, and he knew what had been going on. But in Matthew, Pilate asks Jesus if he's the one called King of the Jews, but he hasn't been called King of the Jews when he rides into Jerusalem. In Luke's Gospel, when the priests bring Jesus to Pilate, this is another thing that Luke thinks is a surprise. He's kind of asking, how does Pilate know that Jesus was the King of the Jews? And so the priests say, this is the one they call King of the Jews. And Pilate says, so you're the one they call King of the Jews. And Jesus says, you said so. So it's another place where you see Luke observing something in the Gospels that he thinks needs to be adduced in advance. And so he does that because, again, it's better in terms of how, if you read ancient rhetorical handbooks on how to write a narrative, Luke's narrative is superior, and he specifically calls it a narrative at the beginning of his gospel. So he knows his rhetoric, he knows his forms, and he thinks he can spot the deficiencies of his predecessors, and he can clean up some of these details.
Do you think that Luke only had Matthew and Mark in front of him, or did he have much more that we don't know about?
It's impossible to know. It's possible that he had other stuff. But when I read the uniquely Lucan material, I tend to think that that's Luke writing and not a long lost source. The story of the rich man and Lazarus, for example, the other lost parables that I mentioned, those are in Luke 15 and 16. That John the Baptist is preaching social justice, right? These are Luke's agendas throughout Luke Acts. And so when we see those kinds of dialogues, those kinds of stories, I tend to think that they come from Luke's own mind. When he gives you the story that Jesus raises the widow's only son, we have Elijah, Elisha narratives. We can see how he can look at that and want you to make the connection between Jesus and Moses and Elijah. And if you don't catch it from any of the Gospels, but especially from Luke, well, at the Transfiguration, Jesus is going to talk to Moses and Elijah. So he's going to paint Jesus. It's like paper dolls. We have Jesus wearing a loincloth and we have Moses wearing a loincloth. We could just take the Moses clothes and put them on Jesus. And we have Jesus as the new Moses, which was a famous book by Dale Allison on the Gospel of Matthew. We can have Jesus as the new Elijah. Thomas Brody wrote a really good book looking at all the places where Luke uses the Elijah motif, and to be sure, he went too far in seeing what scholars sometimes call parallelomania, that you just go wild trying to make every last connection. But there are a number of places throughout that book where you say that really works. I do think that's how Luke is writing. He's imitating the Septuagint and he's imitating specific stories from it. And again, it's how people learned how to write, and it shouldn't surprise us when we find it.
What about the extent of Jesus' ministry? How does that come out in each of the Gospels?
The Synoptics don't tell you at all. They are not interested in that question, it seems. But it doesn't seem like Jesus' ministry lasts all that long. So one of the things I did was just start by counting up all the Sabbath days that you could find, or all the references that would entail that a Sabbath day had passed. So the 40-day temptation of Jesus is the single longest event in the Synoptic Gospels. Luke will say it was 8 days after Jesus had made a passion prediction that the transfiguration occurs, as opposed to 6 days in the other Gospels. There's another Sabbath. And then if you go Sabbath, Jesus does a healing. And then Luke will clarify it was on the next Sabbath that Jesus did this other healing. You count up all these Sabbaths, and then you add the 40-day the 40-day temptation narrative to it. And then you have the crucifixion and the resurrection. You can have as little as 100 days in the Gospel of Luke. But there's a big problem with saying Jesus' ministry was that short in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the problem is Jesus will send out his disciples and he will say, go and preach and go and heal. And they'll go and do that, and then they'll come back. And there's no reference to how much time that took. Were they back within a week and we could keep with our neat little just count the Sabbaths? Or were they gone for 3 months? And the answer is, I don't know. I do this all the time in class. I'll ask a question like this and I'll say, nobody will answer. And I'll say, somebody say, I don't know. And some student will say, I don't know. And I'll say, you're exactly right. You don't know. You can't know. So I call them montages. In film terms, this would be a montage where we see different disciples in different places with different healings and different teachings, and then people who are being cured and taught, whatever. We don't know how long that took. John is very conscientious about how long Jesus' ministry took, whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke only have one Passover during Jesus' ministry. Nothing, despite all those montages I mentioned, nothing that would indicate that the ministry lasts longer than a year. John has a 2-year ministry because he has 3 Passovers. And the whole gospel, the whole ministry of Jesus is framed around these big events. And you can turn the page and get to the Feast of Hanukkah in chapter 10 and realize, oh, this is 3 to 4 months after the Feast of Sukkot that we have just been at. And so in film terms, that's a big fade to black. and then we fade slowly in, and the season is different. It's wintry. It's rainy season in Jerusalem, right? So John wants to tell you that Jesus' ministry lasted 2 years because it encompassed these 3 Passovers. It's another place where I think he knows that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have shown little, if any, interest in the chronology of Jesus's ministry. And they've given you the one trip to Jerusalem for the one Passover during his ministry. At one point in Luke, we have Jesus going into Judea also to preach in some synagogues there. But for the most part, yeah, we have absolutely no idea how long any of this lasted. And so John gives you a very different chronology.
You could give us some examples of the Gospels being rewritten. Is there evidence of this in the manuscript tradition, that some of the text is being revised or changed, altered?
In the manuscript tradition, in terms of like the transmission of each individual gospel, yes. Or to an extent, yes, we see scribal harmonizations where you can tell that scribes know that Matthew and Luke were a little different. Cambry Pardee has his doctoral dissertation looked at this phenomenon pretty extensively, and Matthew tends to exert the most influence on the other gospels, but you can see almost any gospel influencing any other at one time or another. In our earliest big codices, where we have all 4 gospels complete, this is a scribal tendency. A famous example is Jesus' side being pierced in the Gospel of John. It's the only of the 4 gospels where that happens, and lo and behold, it shows up in manuscripts of Matthew. And you know that it's an interpolation into Matthew, that it wasn't originally there. And Matt Crawford has made this argument because when Eusebius in the 300s comes up with his canons and sections to say what's unique to each gospel, or what's in these 2 gospels, what's in these 3 gospels, those 3 gospels, what's in all 4 gospels, he has a list of stuff that's only in Matthew and John. And the side piercing is not one of those things. So if his manuscripts of Matthew had already had the side piercing, he would have assumed, oh, okay, that's one of these Matthew-John parallels. And that's not something Eusebius does. But it is something we see scribes doing in the manuscript tradition. And I think those kind of text critical interpolations, relocations, slight rewritings, harmonizations give us a glimpse at something the synoptists themselves did on a much grander scale, a much greater degree of rewriting, something that might have been glossed in a margin of, oh, this other gospel says this. We can see those marginal glosses eventually penetrating the main text. And this is something that happens all throughout the transmission of the Bible, even in the Middle Ages.
And do we see this happening in the Septuagint recensions as well?
We do, yeah. Samuel Kings and Chronicles is a common go-to, and it's a little more complicated because we have the Greek and the Hebrew are already kind of different, but we can see similar things. Elisha narratives where an element is borrowed and presupposed up on the roof. Somebody will go to sleep and you're like, we weren't even told that they went into a house, and it's because they have this other narrative in mind. Steve McKenzie has written about this with Samuel Kings and what happens when you compare the Hebrew and the Greek, what happens when you bring in the chronicler, those types of things. So it's not at all an unusual phenomenon to see people collecting and comparing and noting these similarities and working in little details here and there. Again, it's just that the gospel writers do it on a much grander scale. But we see Tatian writing the Diatessaron and taking bits of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He can use multiple gospels in a single sentence. When he writes Feeding of the 5,000, he can use all 4. So this idea that people would do what I argue throughout the book, that you would collect, if say you're John, that you would collect Matthew, Mark, and Luke, closely compare them and study them, and then write your own story. That to me is just not difficult at all, whether it's done by an individual, whether it's done in a group setting. And we can already see scribes who are doing similar things just on a smaller scale.
What about Codex Bezae? And this is in regards to the longer ending of Mark and also the woman caught in adultery. Would those be examples of rewriting?
Sort of. Yeah, with the longer ending of Mark, it's a great example of harmonization. It's the kind of thing that Tatian does, because the longer ending of Mark doesn't really tell you anything that you don't already have from the resurrection appearances in Matthew, Luke, John, and even potentially episodes from Acts. And so that it comes at the end of Mark, and that the Codex you mentioned, that Bezae is in, we're going to get the so-called Western order of the Gospels, I'm going to get the number wrong if I say it off the top of my head. But then we go Matthew, John, Luke, Mark, and then Acts. Is that Papyrus 45? Am I right about that? The big early codex of the four Gospels and Acts.
I think so.
Yeah, so it makes sense that if Mark is last early on of the four Gospels, but it transitions to Acts, then we would have resurrection accounts that from Matthew, John, and Luke, and you'll be able to take up a snake and not be hurt by it. Well, we know that happens to Paul, and when we read the book of Acts. So it is a very creative rewriting and harmonization that we see elsewhere. When it comes to the woman caught in the act of adultery, that's a very, very much a creative writing exercise. So it's more taking the form of a controversy story and creating a character and creating dialogue, and it's it could very broadly be called rewriting, but I would just call it more imitation. And imitation is simply how you learn to write. Here is your model, and then copy it exactly, and now rewrite it in some new way. We have an example of this. St. Augustine, before he was Christian, when he was a professor of rhetoric, he talks about Virgil's Aeneid, and he has to compose a speech by Dido, but it's for a rhetorical competition, and he has to give this performance of this speech that he has composed, and it has to be from Dido, but it can't use any of the vocabulary that Dido actually uses in the Aeneid. And so now I don't think anybody's quite that skilled rhetorically, like Quintilian level of rhetoric when we talk about the gospel writers, but that they had a lower level of education where they were familiar with that sort of idea of, hey, let me take this story and turn it into that story. I mentioned Luke saying, oh, okay, I've got an Elijah story. The widow's only son has died. I can add that as a resurrection story beyond the man's Jairus's daughter that we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I can add another one to that. I think we see a similar thing with the woman caught in the act of adultery in John, that somebody's just imitating the style and slipping it in. But that one I think comes along much, much later than the longer ending of Mark, which is already known to Tatian in the mid to late 2nd century, because it's in the Diatessaron.
What did T.C. Scott conclude about the codices?
Well, he wrote a lot about codices, but he also, Skeet wrote this famous article about, it's a very short note about scrolls. And so I kind of followed in his footsteps and made my own scroll to say, scholars have long talked about scrolls as being very cumbersome to work with. And that's only because we're familiar with books like this that have two covers and we flip in codex form and we read that way because that's how books have been made. But they weren't always made that way. They were written on scrolls for millennia. And so scholars would say, oh, it would be so hard to do that. And Skeet said, it wouldn't be hard at all if you knew how to use one. And that's the only way you knew how, besides a wax tablet or slate tablet, if that's the only way you knew how to read and write, that would just be the way you did it. And so he wrote this short note about some wallpaper that his wife had. And so he said, I took this roll of wallpaper and I just rolled it from one end to another the same way you would a scroll, and it didn't take that long. And so I made a full-scale replica of the Gospel of John using Codex Vaticanus, and I can scroll from the beginning to the end of it in 5 minutes. And I can even scan as I read, and I know the Gospel of John well enough to know where I'm at. If I'm at the Nicodemus discourse and what we know as chapter 3, or if I'm much later, I'm getting into the farewell discourse or something like that. Like I can scroll and I can use, and you keep it about this. I'm going kind of shoulder width as I sort of imitate how I would use it, and that gives you 2 to 3 columns in view, and you just learn tactile how to maneuver it. And as long as you keep it rolled pretty tight, it's not hard at all to move forward and backward. If you let loose of your grip, it starts to unroll and it gets unruly. But if you keep it tight rolled like some acid wash jeans in the 80s, man, you can get through that scroll from beginning to end in 5 minutes. And it's not at all cumbersome. It's not at all difficult. And scholars have forever exaggerated the difficulty level of using a scroll. And we just have to stop with this. It's nonsense. It would not have been difficult at all. And, one person could use multiple scrolls. All you need are paperweights, and you could use that to write another gospel. But again, it's one of these misconceptions in the ancient writing process that I've tried to dispel. And I've done that by making my own models. People say, well, it would be hard to draft something on a wax tablet. So I made a wax tablet, and I said, would that be hard? And on this little triptych, I can get you a column of a scroll. And so when I get the story exactly the way I want it, I can transfer it. And probably any ancient writer would have had more of a little bookshelf of these, so where you could get multiple columns, and then at some point you would transfer that draft from wax tablet to a scroll, and then you would still make revisions to what's in that scroll, and you would strike something out and make a note in the margin, and then that would get transferred to another. And that's just how people wrote books for well over 1,000 years. And a lot of what I try to do in my writing chapter, and I try to write the entire book in a very accessible manner that anybody can read. I hope that scholars learn from it, but even somebody who's just remotely interested in where the Gospels came from, it's written to be a very highly accessible book. And I start out one chapter talking about being a freshman in high school and taking a typing class, and all these typewriters pounding at 8 o'clock in the morning. And today, if I imagine myself trying to write the book that I wrote on a typewriter, I can do it because I spent a year in a typing class. But there's no way I would do it because my computer over here is so much easier to work with. But you have to think that we are editing ourselves at the speed of thought. And that was completely impossible for thousands of years. You had to write something on a wax tablet, and then you had to erase it, and then you had to rewrite it, and you had to think. And Quintilian talks about the process of cogitation, that even before you write, you have to think about what you write. And so we could do it so speedily with a computer today that it's hard to imagine that, well, just 50 years ago, I would have had to have written this book on a typewriter. And just 50 years before that, I would have had to have handwritten the whole manuscript. And then the handwriting would get moved to movable type. So I think the more we kind of go back and actually get in touch and get our hands on ancient media and reenact it and say, could you use a scroll? Could you use a codex? How would you make a codex? Well, like this. Here's a codex, a single quire codex of the Gospel of John. and you can tell that it's way more portable than the scroll. And so, yeah, that probably has something to do with why the Codex caught on. But just because I prefer the Codex doesn't mean it was a given or a necessity that had to emerge. It's just something that came along and stuck. But for people who like to read on a Kindle or on a tablet, they're just using a big long scroll, aren't they? Right? They're just swiping, and it's we're kind of back to going that way. We just do it virtually. So I think taking some time to reflect on ancient media, how it worked, actually doing the craftsmanship to reenact this and say, was this easy or was this hard? Hard compared to using my computer? You betcha. But that's something that only somebody of our generation could even imagine. Even my mom has written books, several of them. And I remember the first one that she wrote on a computer. It was a Commodore 64 with 5 1/4 inch floppy disks, right? And that was this huge advancement over the previous books that she had written on a typewriter. So in my lifetime, I've seen a radical transformation of writing technology. And so I devote a whole chapter to that, to say, how do we think this stuff actually worked? And let's get some of these misconceptions out of our head. And let's actually get back in touch with these ancient modes of writing and see what they illuminate in terms of the writing process. And I think it shows a lot. I hope that my book shows that it shows a lot when you start to think of things that way.
What do you make of M.E. Boymar's multi-sources for John?
Boymar and Brown and Bultmann and Anderson and Cam von Valdi and everyone who posits a multi-stage composition of the Gospel of John has done. They've all done a lot of really hard work, and they've all convinced themselves that the Gospel of John was written in these stages. And they have all failed to convince me that John was written in these multiple stages, because I simply think it's unprovable. We don't have any manuscript evidence of the Gospels, arising in these various stages. Did John, whoever John is, right, who the author that we call John, who wrote the Gospel, we call the Gospel according to John, whoever wrote that, however many of those people there were, did they write in multiple stages, revising their work as they went? Absolutely, because that's how everyone wrote a book. And they didn't start at the beginning and finish at the end and write the whole thing in one pass. I dare to say no book has ever been written that way in history. I'm writing a short essay that's due this week. And I know what the outline is going to be. And I know that I am not writing it in the order that it's going to be in. And this is a very, very short work. And so on that level, I think you can say everything that was ever written was written in multiple stages. But the idea that I can isolate that at this point in time, there was a version of the Gospel of John that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And then at this later time, it had expanded because this other source had penetrated it and been worked in. And then there was John 2.0 that had a beginning, a middle, and an end under the influence of these sources. And finally, there was John 3.0 that at this other identifiable place and time had incorporated yet other sources and had introduced this new vocabulary. All of that is so speculative that I think it needs to be tossed out, and we need to stop trying to reconstruct those things that are purely hypothetical and start with the Gospel of John as we have it. Start with the Synoptic Gospels as we have them. We can look at text critical variants as we need to, like the side piercing in Matthew, and that's in our ancient manuscripts, and say, yeah, but that doesn't belong, right? We can take out a few things, but otherwise, I think we should just stick with the Gospels as we have them and ask how they are interrelated, and dispense with all of the suppositions that then has a hypothesis built upon it, and then has this huge edifice on top of all of that, because it's ultimately a house of cards that one flick at the bottom, there is no basis for it because it's just too speculative ever to be provable.
In my closing question, can you elaborate on this is from page 147? You state some of John's most distinctive traits show up in the rewriting of episodes from the synoptics. John likes to assign individual speaking parts, where other gospels have the disciples seemingly speak in unison.
Yeah, I mentioned the one from the feeding of the 5,000. This idea of where is the food going to come from if there are this many people? It's something the disciples say, and except in musicals, I don't think people speak in unison that much. And so Jesus will ask Philip, "Where do you think we're going to get this much food?" Philip's like, "I don't know." And Andrew comes along and says, "Well, I've got this food," and so he'll divide this up. I mentioned that it's Judas who is singled out individually as the one who complains about the cost of the ointment that Jesus was anointed with. And elsewhere, it's just the disciples or some of the people who were there were grumbling about the cost. Well, this should have been sold and given to the poor. John will single out one individual. The priests will speak against Jesus collectively in the synoptics, and John turns Caiaphas, the high priest, into a leading character. And I teach Jesus in film, so I think very much in film terms that John is casting this. And you could go even beyond that of places where there aren't synoptic parallels, but Thomas never says a word in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, but Thomas gets individual speaking parts in John and becomes a significant character. So yeah, it's just one of the things that John does. Mark Goodacre is going to talk about this in his forthcoming book again. We were talking at an SBL meeting. He's been a great friend and supporter. Wrote the foreword to my book. I couldn't be more grateful for him. And we were talking along with Chris Skinner at an SBL meeting, just having a couple of drinks and saying, "Do you think we should compare notes at some point since we're both writing these books?" And I can't remember at this point which one of us brought it up, like the thing about the feeding of the 5,000, the assigning of the individual speaking parts. And Mark Goodacre calls this John's dramatization of the synoptics, that he very much thinks in terms of ancient drama and characters and their speaking parts. And we just laughed and said, yeah, let's not compare notes because maybe great minds think alike and we have some of the same ideas. But ultimately, it turns out we wrote two books that are on the same topic, that argue the same thesis, that are very complementary. But that's one detail that we both noticed. It's a thing that's easy to miss if you've been lulled into thinking that John is so different from the synoptics that he can't be related to them. If you say, but yeah, if he did read the synoptics, why would it be different? One of the obvious things that starts to jump out to you is, oh, because these people speaking in unison just kind of sounds dumb. So let me tell you precisely who said what, when, and where.
And just as a reminder, I have the link to James Barker's book in the description below, and it's also going to be in the pinned comment as well. With that being said, thank you very much for joining me today, James.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure speaking to you as always.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.